All right, let's get going. So this is the 7th of this series of 8 talks. In some respects, though, it's like the last one because the 8th is going to be completely different. The 8th is looking forward to the future, asking questions about multilingual education, education in mother tongues, if you like, the future of endangered languages and endangered alphabets. And I'm going to have a special guest who has been involved in that literally all his life. So what I want to do today is return to some of the images and some of the themes that we've looked at in previous talks, but come at them from rather different directions and come up with some ideas that I think are worth sort of carrying forward. So one of the things that, as I've said before, really defines the Endangered Alphabets project is that it began as a visual project. It began with carving rather than actually knowing anything about the subject on my part. And so that really granted me a privileged way of looking at literally and thinking about writing. As I come to the end of this series of talks and also the end of writing my Atlas of Endangered Alphabets, I found myself having to define, you know, what is an endangered alphabet? What is an alphabet? And I found myself asking, what is writing? What should even be included in the Atlas of Endangered Alphabets? And in particular, this came about because I had been talking about and showing images of, you know, one of my favorite symbol systems, namely the Adinkra symbols from Ghana, West Africa. And somebody said to me, yeah, but that isn't writing. And I thought, we really need to look into this. So we've looked at this slide before, I think, but I think it's really worth going back to. So here we have, this is a sort of a standard contemporary definition. So it goes, writing is a series of graphic marks representing the units of a specific language, okay? And it talks about where it was invented. And then it says, the evolution of writing from tokens to pictography, syllabary, and alphabet illustrates the development of information processing to deal with larger amounts of data in ever greater abstraction. So I've been thinking about that definition, and I thought, you know, if you ask the question, what is a guitar, as I did when I was writing my guitar book, and you say, okay, so a guitar is a 6-stringed hollow wooden instrument that is played rested on the knee and is played, you know, with the fingertips. And the fact is that if you think about, say, a pedal steel guitar, absolutely none of those criteria applies to a pedal steel. It is a beast of a different color altogether, and yet in some respects, clearly a guitar. So I thought, all right, let's think about that definition of writing. And my question is not, is that definition right? But is it all? And I'm going to really in particular raise your attention to the fact that that definition really defines writing in terms of sound. That the purpose of writing is to encode sound. And we'll come back to that later. So there was also something in that definition of the evolution of writing that just didn't feel right to me. Especially after doing these carvings of these sort of amazing systems that were in some sense graphic or pictographic, but the notion that they were somehow evolutionarily undeveloped really struck me as it struck me as a bad note, a wrong note. And I also didn't like the idea that somehow, and in that definition, we move from pictures and scratches to something that is really all about the information revolution. It's about, again, how much information can this encode in ever increasing levels of abstraction. So I asked myself, where does that definition, where does that idea even come from? And I think we've seen this slide before, but I think it's really worth returning to. So those ideas of what language is, what writing is and how it develops, really are profoundly influenced by two of the early figures in anthropology. So in Ancient Society in 1877, so notice the date, both these are right around the time of the publication of The Origin of Species. Lewis Henry Morgan argued that writing, and especially the written alphabet, was the sole innovation that marked the passage of humankind from what he called the upper status of barbarism to the final and consummate status of civilization, which really sounds kind of reminiscent of the evolutionary notion that we heard before from that contemporary definition. At roughly the same time, this general passage was broken down into linguistic stages by one of the earliest and most influential cultural anthropologists, who argued that as a culture evolved, its writing system evolved. So this was Edward Burnett Tyler in Researches in the Early History of Mankind and the Development of Civilization. Again, 1865, right there in colonial, colonial European heyday. He proposed that writing progressed from ideograms through to verbal, syllabic, and finally alphabetic glyphs, each step denoting the intellectual and social progress of that society towards presumably some kind of Anglo-Victorian ideal. Okay, so I am now going to tell you something about my education, which, even though it happened in the 60s, was also kind of an Anglo-Victorian ideal in many respects. Certainly, most of the buildings were Anglo-Victorian. Some of the teachers were probably Anglo-Victorian as well. A lot of the desks too, I think. So in elementary school, it's amazing how similar elementary education was when I was in elementary school in the late 50s and early 60s to the way we think of elementary education today. It was somewhat child-centered. Children were called by their first names. There was no dress code. People were encouraged to draw pictures and put them up on the wall. There were, kind of games involved in the act of learning. And in a sense, it was an extension of, the home, the playing field, the playground rather. And everything changed as soon as I moved into secondary education at the age of 11, when it was 1964. So it immediately felt like going back in time. School uniforms, everybody was called by their last name. Teachers were always to be addressed as sir, never by their actual name. There was a very strong element of discipline involved, including beatings. A lot of education was conducted simply either by reading the textbook or by reading notes the teacher had written up on the chalkboard. And looking back, it was really clear that the goal of education had very little to do with what you learned, subject matter, content, or even strategies for learning, which were, heaven knows, not even considered. It was more that the purpose of education was to teach you how to look and act like an adult. And in fact, there was even a sort of a step-by-step development in the clothing you were supposed to wear as part of the uniform, where more and more you started to look like something like a cross between a city businessman and a soldier in terms of the dress code. Taking this over to the issue of writing, it was also really interesting how the notion of the nature and purpose of writing and of language tied in with this notion of what it was like to be an adult. So when we were in elementary school, we wrote stories, we drew pictures to go with the stories. All of that was left behind as juvenilia. Instead, we were expected to take dictation and take down notes. We're expected to do précis and summaries of information, write analytical papers, be critical. I can remember when I was 17, writing an essay talking about how immature John Keats' early poetry was. And this was the kind of behavior that we were supposed to exhibit, sort of imitating the adults. Now, what imitating the adults really means is moving away from your own identity and subjectivity. Talking about oneself as one, for example, writing lab reports in science subjects in the passive voice, 2 ounces of this were added to this kind of thing. And in terms of debate and argument, not arguing your own position, but learning to argue for the sake of the strategies of rhetoric. Your own position was not only irrelevant, it was potentially detrimental. And so the evolution of writing that we were taught was actually an evolution towards a sort of, first of all, on the one hand, definitely a colonial ideal. There was this sense that we are being educated to be leaders, to be ready in a crisis, to put one's own feelings back and to deal with the situation. But there was also a sense that, I'm thinking again of that definition of increasing levels of abstraction, intellectual abstraction, this sense that that was where we were heading for. And the evolution of our personalities and the evolution of our studies and our writing would all move towards this kind of abstract ideal where the self was lost altogether. So, excuse me while I look at my notes. I hate that I've been taking notes here because now I have to look at them. Okay, so I want to go back to a story that happened in about 1969. And I've told this story again, but I'm going to come at it from a slightly different position. So I was moved across to the other side of the classroom, and I found myself sitting next to this kid who was this sort of loner. He was kind of prickly little kid, and he would spend his time doodling. And I started looking over my shoulder to see what he was doing. And what he was doing was exactly the opposite of what all the rest of us were being trained to do. Let's have a look at the slide now. So what he was doodling was what, if you look on the left, it was becoming at that time album art. And so he was taking letters and he was fattening them or italicizing them or blending them into each other or making them like other things. So what he was doing was on the left. What we were doing was on the right. So there you have it in 72 point Times New Roman. He was going with the yes, we were going with the no, everybody else. And by the way, speaking of Times New Roman, it seemed to me that the epitome of this relationship between education and abstraction and buying into colonial values and writing was something that I didn't actually see till I came to the United States, which just goes to show this wasn't just an English thing. So what I discovered was I was talking to people in graduate school, and they were saying that they had to submit all of their work in Times New Roman. Nothing else was acceptable. So there you have this epitome of the sense that the unimpeachable conformity of one's writing is one of the qualifications for the highest levels of education. The higher up you go, the more you are conforming and losing your sense of identity. So, okay, so we'll leave the Times New Roman right now. Having argued that I think that early definition of writing we saw is really value-laden in ways that most people may not think about, I want to look at something completely different. I want to go to southern China. So we're going to have a look at a writing system or symbol system or something called Shui Shu. So the Shui people, extraordinary tradition of document keeping, should we call it. So the word Shui means water. Excuse me for my pronunciation. Olish is sitting there going, I cannot believe this guy thinks he knows anything. Right, I don't know anything. I've said that many times. Because the word for the people means water, collectively they're referred to as the aquarium, and their collective books of knowledge are called water books. And they are these extraordinary compilations of a combination of encyclopedia, history, law book, calendar, book of spells, etc., etc. The oldest were written in bamboo tip ink, the more recent with a brush. They are not written with an explicit character to meaning correspondence, so they can only be read by someone knowledgeable in the subject, as was always the intention with the Shui script. And other Shui texts include divination cards, scrolls, and this particular one has 59 pages, five kinds of colors, painted figures, buildings, all this kind of stuff. The illustrations are realistic, vivid, and familiar, reflecting the ancient aquarium's pursuit of a better life and the pursuit of beautiful culture and art. And so let's have a look at what one of these things actually looks like. So when you look at this, it's pretty clear that some of the characters are what you might call writing, and some of them are what you might call drawing or art. And then you've also got this really interesting variation in the use of color. So I want to attack this notion that writing and art are two separate things. I just want to say, I'm going to be arguing that our definition of writing is just way, way too limited. So thanks, Ken. Nice comment coming in there. So let's have a look at another of these really ancient shamanistic divination systems. This one is from Greater Tibet, and this is Elsu Shaba. And so what we have again is a series of stylized drawings and a combination of things that seem to be representative and things that seem to be more ideographic. It's a whole bunch of things. And if you remember earlier, I talked about this notion of writing supposedly encoding sound. And here, writing is encoding a lot of things. So if you move on to the next slide. We're going to see one of the Elsu Shaba diagrams. And this is what it has been interpreted as meaning. The 9th day of the first lunar month will be a dog day, will be a fire day. In the morning, there will be a fog under the earth before sunrise. Clouds will appear in the sky, a ritual sword and a religious implement will appear afterwards. This means the morning will be a good morning. After midday, 2 stars will die, etc., etc. So, and by the way, the script is written by hand, usually with a bamboo brush, animal hairs dipped into red, yellow, blue, white, black, and green inks. And the color may affect the meaning of the symbol. We talked about this before. Sebastian pointed out this was also true in Ditema Tsadinoko. The researcher Sun Hongai reported seeing the pictograph stars and moon written in black to mean dim or not brilliant, whereas when written in white, it meant shining and was auspicious. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And that is all of the information in this tiny little square there. So it seems to me that rather than not encoding much information, these graphic scripts actually encode scads of information. So if we can just move on to the next one. Sometimes, by the way, these are called proto-writing. Whoops, I've gone too fast. I'm sorry, my fault. Can we back up to the previous one again? Sorry, Alec. Sometimes these are called proto-writing. And proto-writing is kind of a backhanded compliment, I think. It sort of means they haven't figured out writing yet, but give them time and they might. And one of the arguments that is made against this really being writing is that it cannot, is that writing should be able to be read unambiguously by anybody who speaks that language. And the fact is, I'm not sure any writing can be read unambiguously, but that is the claim that's made for conventional phonetic alphabets. And the sort of the dismissal of scripts like the Shuishu or the Elsu Shaba is that you can't understand them. You know, not everybody can read them. And the fact is, that's the point. They weren't supposed to be read by everybody. They were intended to be read only by people who were initiated in the skills that these systems embodied and possessed. So while we're at it, and just in case you're thinking, oh, it's only these ancient sort of proto-writing systems that have that quality. The fact is, there are many scripts that have been devised that have not been intended to be read. There is an entire form of the Ranjana script of Nepal where all of the letters are sort of beautifully combined into a monogram. And that was used as a secret script because people who really didn't know the script couldn't like tease them apart and figure out what they meant. There was a vogue in 19th century Jakarta for writing entire books in secret scripts. I mean, it gives a new meaning to the phrase roman à clé, because what would then happen is that people would then publish like, it was really like the Voynich manuscript, you know, it's like, this is what this book really means, and here is the key to this book. There was an entire Malay secret system that was essentially a cipher system. But I want to bring in another one here solely because this introduces one of my favorite unknown characters in the history of writing and world politics. Okay, so this, oh, wait a second. I forgot that. Yes, the Nsibidi system, which you see here, was also intended to be read and understood only by the people in the secret leopard societies. And when, in fact, a missionary, yes, thanks, on to the next one. When a missionary asked, you know, what does this mean? So this is the Reverend J.K. McGregor. He goes around saying, okay, so what do these symbols mean? People would, I'm looking at the second paragraph, people smiled when I asked for information and declared they knew nothing about it, which might have been true, or they might have been hiding it from him. And he says, the reason for this is that in Efik, Nsibidi is used almost only to express love, and this term covers such a multitude of most abominable sins that no self-respecting Efik person will confess he knows anything about the writing of it. To which we say, okay. And now I want to continue on to Bilang Balang, and so again, I'm not sure the pronunciation here, but I want to introduce Kolik Puji, whose role in Buddhist literature is even greater than that of any single figure in English, a fact that is all the more remarkable for her being a woman. So she is of noble birth. She's the king's daughter. Born in 1812, she grew up at a time when her island was still struggling against the Dutch to achieve autonomy. Her father entrusted her not only with an education, but with the running of royal affairs. She did so with a possibly unique feat of linguistic subversiveness in order to communicate in secret with others in the Bugis resistance. She began incorporating Bilang Balang characters into the Bugis script. Bilang Balang, the term means numbers, specifically Arabic numbers, was an importation of one of the secret shorthand scripts used by Muslim travelers or the Gujarati merchants of Northeast India, which had spread along trade routes into South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Indonesia. Because these characters were numbers which were not only incomprehensible to the Dutch, but appeared to have no meaning when embedded in a text, they had a fascinating hidden in plain sight quality and became woven into the Bugis Makassar script. Okay, so much for the whole point about writing being that it must be understood by everybody. Having said that, thank you, Alec. Now we can move on. And going back to my my Adinkra images. So you've seen these Adinkra images many times now, and again, these are challenged as being they're not writing, they're pictograms or ideograms. So I want to point out that pictograms and ideograms have significant advantages, especially in areas where multiple languages are spoken. The very fact that symbols don't indicate sounds enables them to travel beyond the borders of specific language groups, like passports of meaning. And by the way, it's worth bearing in mind that language is tribal. So what I mean by that is that it connects a group, but it also excludes outsiders. But Adinkra doesn't do this. And this is exactly why Europe has universal traffic signs that display symbols rather than give verbal instructions. And in case you haven't seen them, here we go. That is the Adinkra of the European continent, ladies and gents. So all of those are signs and symbols which is designed to exclude writing, because writing would actually hamper their meaning. So as anybody who has got lost in Europe and has tried to ask directions and is told, oh, deuxième à gauche et puis tout droit, and they have no idea what you're talking about, this is the answer. So you have a writing/symbol system that has the virtue of universal comprehensibility. Okay, so moving on now, I think what we're doing here, what I'm trying to do here, is to do what Simon Battistini is saying here, which is he's talking specifically about African systems. He says, we think it is improper and wrong to perpetuate the myth that phonetic writing is superior to other systems of signs. The mélange of forms we are starting to see in the West, he points out, already exists in Africa. All the so-called historical stages of the development of writing are present in contemporary Africa, and some different scripts have been extant side by side for a long time or are used alternately for the same language. And I would say that, as I say, this mélange of forms, we're starting to see it in the West as well, where we have our sort of very narrow view of the importance of a phonetic script, but we also have ... emojis. And we not only use them under different circumstances for different purposes, but also informally, we blend them into the same utterance. With that in mind, I want to sort of return to this notion of graphic writing. And as Olish is saying, and a couple of other people have been saying, it's like, this is no big invention. The Chinese have been doing this for 3,000 plus years, this combination of phonetic and graphic qualities, but it doesn't seem right to us because, and this is the whole point of today's talk, ladies and gents, the history is written by the winners, and history is written in the alphabet of the winners. Just because we are top dogs doesn't mean that our definition of writing is the right definition. It's not right just because we do it. And just to give you an example, final example here of what I think is the most extraordinary graphic writing system. So these are firmas, or signatures. And this is an Afro-Cuban system. It's closely based on mostly Congolese origin symbols, but it's really been developed in Cuba. And like so many of these other incredibly rich visual systems, it's connected to divination and communication with the spirit world. And I'm not even going to tell you what this particular firma says, because as you can see, the one that's on the left is broken down into multiple subsets, 19.1, 90.2, 90.3, and on the next page, 90.4, 90.5. And every single one of them has an explanation that goes on for like 3 or 4 paragraphs. But I want to see what Barbaro Martinez Ruiz says about them, because this is really at the crux of everything. So he says, although firmas are widely used within Afro-Cuban culture, relatively few people can actually read and write this form of graphic writing. Their rarity is in part a result of the system's complexity, which demands a professional religious education, close work with a priest to learn the range of symbols, the syntax and structural components, and many, whoops, it says years of practice. I think we probably mean years of practice, although years of practice is a wonderful idea as well. Notice, by the way, also that they're non-linear. They can be read from different directions. So they have that kind of cosmographic quality that everything comes together rather than being linear. Firmas are used to depict and call forth spirit forces, communicate with ancestral spirits, and facilitate divination. The signatures function as a type of map or electrical circuit. Isn't that a great notion? Whereby the electricity and force of God, like the cosmic vibrations manifested through religious objects, circulate and materialize. So this is the opposite of high abstraction. This is a symbol that acts as a portal between the material and the immaterial worlds. Signatures are used to convey feelings, intentions, and desires to spiritual forces and serve as a means for a practitioner to visualize and communicate with the powers of the spirits. Like a text that conveys holy scripture, signatures enable both aesthetic and conceptual understandings of religious values. So what he means, I think, by aesthetic understandings is that there is a kind of éclat that is the visual component of writing that way back at the beginning of the Endangered Alphabets project was what I was really drawn to, the fact that it's not just the representation of a sound, it's not just a semantic unit, it is a visual and auditory and phonetic ensemble, and all of those dimensions have their own power. So he says, signatures are also used to energize people with the forces summoned by this signature. When the people supplement the motion of the firma through dance and gesture, which goes back to the point we were making about writing as performance, the result is a graphic in motion that becomes a perfect symbol of God as a unifying and active spirit. Similarly, firmas are used for healing and meditation and for the facilitation of mutual transactions of energy between priests, practitioners, and God, or the forces relevant to a particular religious experience. Firmas are also used to teach practitioners religious values and to provide instruction in the organization of time and the sequencing of ritual components within the religious ceremony. So that very last part is the way in which Dongba and Elsu Shaba and Shuishu are often explained. It's like, oh, these are just like memos as to what order the ritual needs to be carried out in. And I think, I've got no proof of this, but I think it's much more likely that the symbol itself, whether it's something that we might call writing or something which we might call a drawing or a design, that has power and force in itself. And what moves through it and the recitation of it is exactly what I was talking about when I was quoting from the writing about 5 talks ago, where the very act of opening a book, let alone writing or reading, is part of a spiritual exchange between the writer, the reader, and the divine. Whoa. Okay, I think I've come to a stop. And so, as always, I thank you for being here and for paying attention and for sending notes to each other and to me in chat. I encourage you to continue to support the Endangered Alphabets, as many of you have been doing very generously. This has been great. And now I will throw the floor open to questions and comments and heated discussion and spiritual exchanges, frankly.
One thing that your last topic reminded me of was one of the things I've done a little bit is translate, not in any big way, but I have a degree in translation, and one of the things we ran across was the interesting issues that come up when you are translating religious texts, and specifically having to do with the Quran. When I learned that a translation of the Quran is not considered to be the Quran,
right,
it interested me. That issue is very interesting to me. The fact that
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead, sir. Yeah.
No.
I was just thinking about the fact that a translation is not considered to be the actual Quran, so that when you read a translation, anybody who takes that view has the out of saying you've not read the actual article, the genuine article.
Yeah, and that also raises really interesting questions about the definition of the word read, because if you think about the importance of the calligraphy, the Nasali calligraphy in Islamic spiritual texts, then even if you were able to represent it word for word in a different script, then what Olish a couple of weeks ago talked about, the performance of calligraphy is already lost. The drama of the movement of the hand is lost. And that kind of éclat that I was talking about a couple of minutes ago is lost. It's very much like that process of narrowing that I've been railing against all the way through this talk, that our definition of writing does, by sort of boiling it down to, sort of the superiority of the purely abstract phonetic system.
I was just chuckling because I was remembering one of the very first times I was able to read some Arabic calligraphy and how excited I got because, look, I see the word. I see the word.
Exactly. And you see the life of the word, you know. Okay, who's next?
Sorry. Go ahead.
Finn, you're up.
Yes, I forget what it's called when you were looking at the Tibetan script.
Elsu Shaba?
Yes, that's the one. It seemed to me to be more along the lines of like a technical graphic, like you get in a high-level engineering or electrical engineering type textbook.
You remember that Barbaro Martinez Ruiz was talking about how firmas could act as what did he say, a wiring diagram? Something like that?
Yeah, or that sort of thing, not that specific thing.
Right, so that's a really interesting notion, because it goes to show how much extraordinarily complex information can be included in a diagram. Because if you took a wiring diagram and then wrote it out in words, you can pretty much guarantee that nobody would ever be able to fix anything. But I suspect that in addition to that, you also have this layer whereby the symbols and images themselves are charged, to use a term that is both like electrical but also spiritual. And in our sort of materialistic way of looking at things, we want it to be materialistic because we don't necessarily believe in or understand writing or any kind of graphic as a spiritual transaction or emotional transaction. That's just, this is my hunch. As always, I'm an essayist rather than a researcher. I have an idea, I throw it out, we'll see what happens to it. Okay, who's up next?
There was once a science fiction story, and I cannot remember who wrote it or where I saw it, but they talked about a language where you could write a whole technical manual for building a spaceship using 9 words, because that's what that language was made for. That's what that language was geared toward, so that the whole technical manual fit into 9 words, because each word carried so much information. And that's what that reminded me of. But I can't remember what the story was. Perhaps one of y'all's run across it, but that struck with me because 9 words, the whole technical manual.
Yeah.
Well, talking about writing systems and manuals, think about IKEA manuals as a language.
Pretty grim.
But then it is a visual language. Look at this.
Yeah, exactly. And what's more, one of the reasons why IKEA is so successful is because they don't try and do everything purely verbally. Again, it's like the European road sign business. Okay, so I saw some stuff going back and forth between Ken and France and Olish about Unicode playing a part in any of this. Anybody want to jump in on that?
Well, my question with Unicode is always, I know about the changes from right to left, left to right are possible, top, bottom are possible, but then you've got non-linear systems. What then?
Ken, the gauntlet has been thrown down.
So can you elaborate what you mean by non-linear?
Non-linear, like the Nashi one, when you don't really, the notion that they will be in any kind of line, top, bottom, whatever, they are non-linear. They are like tabular sometimes within the same visual phrase. It's more like mathematical notation, I guess. Now I'm thinking of it.
I'm a math student. I would say that most mathematical notation is quite linear.
Okay.
I mean, the only non-linear script I'm aware of is that one that was in the movie that came out a few years ago.
Arrival?
Arrival, yeah.
Arrival, yeah.
But that's completely made up, and it's, you know, yeah.
So when I first started doing the endangered alphabets, I got really interested in the relationship between musical notation, mathematical notation, and writing. And I wondered if anyone had ever done any research to find out whether the brain processes all three kinds of symbol system in the same areas, or whether they are different, because obviously their syntaxes as well as their symbols are different.
I'm only aware of the research that is finding that Chinese is processed a bit differently from alphabetic writing, and similarly to sign languages.
Do you know what areas of the brain they use that are different?
I can't really remember, sorry.
Well,
I think research is beginning to suggest that the idea of particular areas in the brain tends to be a little bit misleading. If you do some reading on people who've suffered severe brain trauma, they found that different areas in the brain can be brought to bear to process just about anything. It's not like the brain is a bookstore where you go in and you find things on this topic or tasks of this sort in one place and tasks of that sort in another. It's a very individual thing, and they're finding that the idea of specific areas is not quite as hard and fast as we used to think it was. And I say this as someone who has a very irregularly shaped brain.
At the other extreme, there's a French neurologist called Dehaene. Is it Stanislas Dehaene? I can't remember. Who has his theorizing is that actually writing consists of like micrographemes, which can actually be a sort of identified with the firings of just specific neurons. And so he's trying to find out whether there are any kind of substructural visual units that are common to all languages. And so he argues that, you know, the cross line, there's some of that everywhere, etc. I personally don't necessarily buy that, but apparently he has done the thing with the electrodes in the brain to see what's going on. So, okay, who's up next?
Thank you for the non-evolution idea.
Okay, so will emojis evolve to encode? Hang on a second, I need to open up my chat window here. So this is from Rohan. Will emojis evolve to encode actual language like what many ancient pictographic systems did eventually?
We hope not.
Emojis have a completely different function.
Yeah, there's been some research being done now that they fulfill a very similar purpose to gesture in spoken language, and can also convey tone. Basically, they're evolving to fill the gaps that have been created by a culture that is becoming increasingly text-based in its communication through
creating thusly a spoken language online.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough that you should bring that up, because I got involved in a discussion just about a week ago about even if writing could actually encode the sound of speech, what are all the other elements of speech communication that are therefore excluded? And so there's gesture, as you say, so much of what's going on, body language, inclination, even the pupils, all this kind of stuff. And there's also all those kind of paralinguistics like and ah and all those other things. So it seems to me again that by our definition, by the standard definition of writing, you're placing an impossible burden on an extremely narrow, we should call it the stiletto heel theory of writing definition. Yeah, there's a huge weight on a tiny little point there. Whereas, as we know, communication is so much richer and broader, and so much of it is visual. Okay, who's up next?
In that connection, I'm curious if you've done much reading on the different systems that try to represent sign language in writing.
I promise I will. How about that? I'm afraid if you start poking around, you discover the oceanic expanse of my ignorance.
I am not in any way implying that, but I'm curious about this because just because of a little anecdotal thing that I read interests me. Often signers, when they become emotionally involved in what they're saying, the signs go higher up in the air. So I'm thinking, even a little thing like that, how exactly do you take some of the systems that people are trying to put together and express even a small thing like that, a small issue like that?
Absolutely, and that's why, again, the relationship between writing or trying to convey meaning and performance is such a rich and broad notion. Yeah, I was at a service at the Glide Memorial Church in San Francisco, and there was the band, and there was the reverend, and there was the signer, and the signer was rocking. The signer was he was filled with the Spirit. Let me tell you, it was a thing in itself. Okay, other questions?
Just one thing. I'm aware that there is a dance notation in existence.
Dance notation, sure.
So you actually can write down in visual way dance moves.
I've seen simple versions of that, but I would be very surprised if there weren't much richer and more complete versions of it.
There are, though. I've talked to a bunch of choreographers, and they don't use it.
Oh, really?
So I don't think it's particularly useful.
So how did they, first of all, how do they remember their own choreography? And secondly, does that mean that they teach it purely through gesture and imitation?
Yeah.
Yes, basically. I do a fair bit of dancing as well, and I've never met anyone who, like, you'll get some stuff with, particularly ballroom, where a step has a specific name and you'll have like the list of steps written out, but no one could ever learn a dance by that. It needs to be taught by a person, usually face to face, so you can work backwards from a video if you know sort of what you're doing already.
Which raises the really interesting question, if video hadn't been invented, would the notation have improved? And I'm thinking right now about like knitting notation, which people can read like music. I mean, my mother could read a knitting pattern, you know, as fast as she could knit, whereas I could read it about as fast as I can read music. I play guitar, but I really can't read music at all. Okay, what else we got? Okay, we got some nice links.
I just
Will emoji
to
yeah,
to voice my sadness at the misunderstanding of evolution that has come out in this talk, and Morgan and Tyler, and it's
go on.
still, I mean, it's kind of funny to see it back at the dawn of evolutionary theory, but it's sad to see it that it still exists, that evolution is leading us on a path towards some awesome end that, you know, has been predetermined, and that's not what evolution is doing, right?
Right, but it's also it's, if you think about it, the way people use evolutionary theory is actually backwards. It's as a way of justifying the present and saying we are now, you know, everything that we can be and should be because, of course, evolution had led us here. Whereas, in fact, we all know that what led them there was lawyers, guns, and money. It's like, yes, your writing system was top writing system because you had gunboats. You were able to overrun people with different writing systems. Okay, we'll take two more questions. Oh, I love it. Great quote from Ken. There are two types of people, those who demand more emoji and those who wish that emoji did not exist.
There was another question from Rohan.
Okay.
Do you think we'll
Rohan.
be able to know what those secret systems mean, like Nsibidi?
So secret systems are, do you remember, those of you who saw, I think it was 3 talks ago, I showed a photo of Stonehenge with all the people standing around trying to figure them out. So an unanswered question is one of the most powerful forces in the universe. This is why a good friend of mine who may even be on the talk today, Chuck Riley, is a librarian at Yale where they have the Voynich manuscript. And people have been trying like they've made it their life's work to translate that thing, simply because on the one hand, it clearly has design, which implies, you know, intent and meaning, but on the other hand, we don't know what it is. And that combination is almost irresistible, I think. And the longer a question lies around, interestingly enough, the more charge I think it develops. So I think that there is never going to be a time when people are not trying to solve things or decode things. Let's take one more question. And by the way, let me just say what fun this has been, and what a great gang you all are, and how much I've enjoyed like seeing your faces and seeing the stuff coming up on chat and the ideas and questions you brought up. Having said that, everything comes to an end. One more question. Now you're all too modest. You don't want to monopolize the last question. It's like the last square of chocolate.
I have a question, but a quote that I came across for an assignment that was sort of in line with the evolution thing you were talking about just before was a quote from Jonathan Swift about language change. In particular, basically, what he was saying, and whether or not we should attempt to stop language changing, which at the time was very much the accepted theory by a lot of people, that like we have the perfect language and we need to stop it changing. And his argument was, I'm sure perfect language exists. And if we had it, we should probably try and stop it changing. But I am in no way of the opinion that English is at that perfect point. And so to stop it changing would be to stop it becoming more perfect. And so it's not something that you should be trying to do.
Yes, and there's a whole richness of background to that because, you know, the whole of the fourth book of Gulliver's Travels is an attack on the Royal Society, which had been formed to understand everything on the basis that, you know, because they were English and they were royally appointed, they would therefore be able to understand everything. And of course, as an Irishman and an outsider, Swift was also not predisposed to necessarily agree with everything that was gospel according to the royal court in England. So yeah. And there's more great stuff coming up in chat. So I'm going to leave you now. As I say, the last one is going to be really, really different. If you know anybody who's interested, either in the future of language or the future of language education, or how do you deal with the political issue of encouraging the education of minorities within their own culture and language and writing system, as opposed to insisting that they become part of a melting pot, losing their identity and becoming like you. Those are the issues that we're going to be tackling next time. So pass the word along, and we are going to fade out with Patricia Julian's wonderful music. I hope to see you all again soon. I will read the chat when Alex sends it to me.
Thank you very much.